Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here live on Radio Gold FM on 96.9 megahertz for Worlds in Collision. You heard Mr. Stephen Schlozman, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, in the first part of our program, who said, who was the author of the Zombie Autopsy. We don't know for how long this would be a science fiction scenario. He talked about how these creatures would get adapted as they suffer from prionic and incurable disease. And we now have Mr. Bortun as our guest. He is a professor of philosophy and a lecturer with the National School for Political Studies and Administration in Bucharest. He teaches the analysis of public discourse, what we are interested in the second half of the show, and corporate social responsibility. And let's see what it is all about the corporate political, the political social responsibility in terms of communication. Thank you for having me invited. It's my pleasure and my honor. Welcome here on Radio Gold FM. We only talked about philosophy. You were invited 3 times before. The first show organized in February. You were by my side, and I'm overwhelmed, especially that we've been knowing each other for 16 years, and I always associated the most interesting and the most exciting talks with you. And I must tell our listeners that it's difficult to have such calm tone discussion, even a contradictory discussion. We identified a common denominator, which is quite rare during our times. Yes, indeed, you're right. It's a matter of people's attitudes towards truth. Whoever loves and appreciates truth is willing to get close to truth. Whoever wants to find a solution for an issue is concerned and solution-oriented. They are not obsessed with having right. This is the largest problem of people. They are so obstinate to be right. They want to prove other people that they are the ones to be right. It's a kind of fight for power instead of being a fight for truth. There are some people who get obstinate of being right, whereas other people simplify things. Since prions and the potential prionic pandemic is such a serious topic, there was a joke, a peasant went to the train station and there was an argument there. People started to swear at them because he prevented them from getting into the train. And the administrator of the station came. He was wearing a cap, he was dressed smartly, and he said, "Sir, where are you going? You seem to be a serious guy." And I am replying, "I go to a wedding." But unfortunately, this type of communicating straightforwardly and simplifying things in a stupid way is rare. Sorry to interrupt you, but this illustrates a kind of simplification when people are simple-minded and they simplify things to the extent of their mind. This is the famous metaphor of Procust's bed. Procust used to either cut or stretch people according to his bed's length, considering that that was the model of normality. So he was cutting and stretching travelers coming to his house. There are simple-minded people, but there is also another type of intentional, an infamous type and immoral type of simplification, which is infamous. I simplify you in order
conveyed
to
throughout
defeat you.
science.
So I
Hold the same
establish a
idea from
target.
yourself, and this is why
I
I
point
consider
to
you're
that
both
target,
of
but
the
this
same
is
opinion.
not
Thank you
your
so much for
conception.
attending this
I
debate.
simplify it
Ladies and
just
gentlemen,
to
I wish you a nice
reduce it
Sunday.
to dust.
I hope
And the
I
second
didn't
type
upset
of
you with this
simplification, which
topic,
is also
and
a
I'll
systematic
invite you
one,
next Sunday
is
for a new
fortunate, and we consider it a methodological
show, Worlds
simplification.
in
For
Collision, and I
methodological
know
and
you'll
effectiveness
be
reasons
here
in terms
faithful
of
to us for
knowledge and
this show.
research,
Thank
people
you so
use to
much for your
simplify.
attendance.
This is the very ordinary use of models in research. Any type of model simplifies things. A map shows the city to you. You get oriented, but it simplifies reality. It doesn't show everything on the field, and you know that. You get oriented using a theoretical model. This corresponds to several realities, but it doesn't correspond precisely to the entire reality. This is why simplification is not necessarily stupid. It is not always infamous. It can be beneficial. Yes, but both strategies can be used. The first option, if I may simplify it myself, can be a kind of inquisition. For instance, you pretend your opponent is coronaceptical, for instance. So you pretend your opponent said something which he actually didn't say, and this is also in line with the second type of simplification, a more general concept where a certain communication channel is connected, where you extract something from your speech and you consider that they believed or uttered something. Can both be used in a type of synergy? Yes, the most invoked devil civilization, which is not very frequent. At the end of the 19th century, the researchers at the Oxford University felt the need to code the civilization of dialogue, civilized dialogue, and drafted the five famous dialogue principles, of which this one: don't pretend your opponent said something that he didn't actually said. This is the simplest way to go, to build your own cue in the dialogue. But the Inquisition used this strategy. If we think about Voltaire or Kant, they went to a pub or to a restaurant, they talk to an individual, and they get to this obvious question: do you believe in God? Yes or not? I cannot remember the precise words, but the person replied something quite vague, and the inquisitor said, oh, you don't believe in God, this is awful. Yes, this is why you should reread the discussion between Luther and Dieta de Labor, or the way Jan Hus was interrogated and judged. Those dialogues are so absurd that you get revolted. It's revolting to what extent those dialogues were manipulatory and to what extent they falsified reality. This is this kind of generic infamity that Schopenhauer, who wrote the Art of Being Right, considered this is a matter of being a villain. Only villains can do that. And Nikita Stănescu, the Romanian poet, tells it in a beautiful, poetic way. in its unique, his unique way. In love, whoever is always right is a lonely person. So, warning, let's not always try to be right because we'll get lonely. Sometimes the relationship to the other person is more important than our truth. I don't know whether the arguments which we will bring, we don't pretend this to be true. We don't pretend to be right all the time. We only provide a mechanism. We bring arguments to explain something. The other day, I called you to ask for an opinion. I think most discussions we both had, since we've been knowing each other, were on historic topics. Yes, for the listeners, I need to point that we only provide some tips for real friendship. I think that real friendship are really productive. Those friendships which don't result in anything are not actual friendships. If we only call on each other for holidays, those are lazy or idle friendships. We have a productive, an actual friendship. And to come back to what I started to say, I was so impressed about you because you have a genuine interest in knowing. You have an epistemic curiosity, as we tell it in the knowledge philosophy. You have a genuine passion for truth. You're really passionate about searching the truth. You may be far from the truth. You may be on the wrong direction. It doesn't matter. We go in a different direction. We must go until the end of our path, and then we look for another path. This causes you to get wise and to get a better methodology in your research. This is why I've always loved to talk to you, because you have such spiritual mobility. Thank you so much. There's no lunch for free, as we say in English. I don't know whether this is the best way to explain what I experienced with this attitude, but this didn't get me friendships. Ironically, this came for a cost. This engagement, this commitment of mine to always get the truth made me not have too many friends. I lost my friends throughout time. That meant that truth meant more to me than some insignificant relationships. I'm not necessarily that type of person who makes a compromise for truth. This is the way I was educated. I wouldn't do that for my own child. What I want to say is that I warn you from the very beginning, this doesn't mean that you need to admit an error when it is error, or to deny the truth when you know it is the truth. But you may simply avoid telling it. There are times and there are circumstances under which you may avoid telling the truth to certain people. And this is our topic for today. This is a way you can use truth. Truth is one of the Eleonomic truths, the good, the beautiful, and the truth. The three entities of philosophy used by the ancient philosophers: good, beautiful, and truth. But according to me, if we're humanists, the good is above the truth. The truth can be falsified for the good sake, and this is our topic today. Am I allowed to prevent truth from being spread if I know that it makes bad rather than good. That was an explanation with Professor Bortun, precisely to take a break from the very serious items we discussed with Professor Schlozman in the first part of our show. He wrote in 2011 about the risk of a prionic pandemic. We said that prions are some toxic agents. They are neither living or dead. They're very infectious proteins which cause spongiform diseases such as the mad cow disease or the itchiness of sheep. It also causes the Creutzfeldt Jakob disease, an incurable neurodegenerative disease, a very rare disease. In science fiction, it is considered a zombie disease because it causes dementia in the preclinical stage before patients get to hospital, and then they cause an uncontrolled behavior, aggressiveness, hallucinations, and in this form, patients can attack people around them. Those patients were compared metaphorically to zombies, precisely. Professor Schlozman said that the only way this is the way he explained it in 2011 and afterwards during interviews, the only way to spread this pandemic is to create a link between a virus and a zombie. And prions, to deliver those prions over air. They can only be delivered over water or mucus, and there is a very high risk. My question that I debated with Professor Schlozman is, in the strictly theoretical case in which we were faced to such a pandemic, how can we communicate it? Can the decision makers tell people directly that we face a very serious neurodegenerative disease? What should the decision makers do to protect the population? And I repeat what Professor Schlozman said earlier, that zombie is a metaphor to keep the order among the non-infected part of the population, because the risk through anarchy or return to tribalism that the non-infected people by anarchy to harm themselves or to harm the others is much serious than the harm that the zombies can do. Yes, this gets us straightforwardly to the core of the problem. Yes, the core of the problem. Because one of the directions in ethics being a subject of philosophy, in terms of generalization, because it's close to the sense of life. The actual question of Aristotle 2000 years ago is, how should we live? What does it mean to live properly? So the actual question lies in the lifestyle and the sense of life. This is why ethics is a part of philosophy. Except that in ethics, there are two fundamental moral values which orient the values in the evolution of ethics as a theory of values, the good and the duty. This is why two types of ethics were structured: the ethics of good or happiness and the ethics of duty. From a subjective point of view of the human subject, the good is happiness. The code for good in the ordinary speech is happiness, being happy. Hedonism is a trend according to which happiness is pleasure. Eudaimonism, where pleasure is at a spiritual level, but still is pleasure. Stoicism, which refers certain austerity. Stoic people are very strict because happiness to Stoics is the relationship between needs and their accomplishment. Less pleasures you have, less needs you have, happier you, the happier you are. And here comes utilitarianism, which was explained in UK in the British morality by John Stuart Mill. This is the ideal of getting happiness maximal. So we're still in the moral of happiness as a desirable state for as many people as possible and at the highest level as possible. And the question is, shall we reveal this problem, which is related to all 7 billion people? This is a general human item. Shall we reveal this problem to better manage it, or we'd rather keep it under silence? We'll call it a virus, and we'll call the treatments, the immunization treatments, vaccines, and so on and so forth, to get people used to an absolutely new reality. But we still talk about it in old concepts, in familiar concepts, for people to understand what happens if people learned all of a sudden that this was a very serious neurodegenerative disease. And not only at a cognitive level, but also at a biological level. This is a very difficult moral dilemma. As any dilemma, it's very difficult to avoid it because both options are unsatisfactorily. In 2014, two Swedish researchers from the University of Dinkeping, Sophie Nystrom and Per Hamström. Professor Hamström was my guest in a show about prionic diseases. They both published an article about prionic diseases, about prions. Our audience needs to understand that only science fiction authors call those zombies as suffering from a prionic disease. But as you saw during the first part of our show, the symptoms of zombies are practically associated to the Creutzfeldt Jakob disease, which is not a science fiction disease. This is indeed a rare disease. Its occurrence is 1 in a million cases. But where comes the risk from? Many papers have been published lately about the synthetics, prions, and their risks. Since this is a very rare disease on a natural mean, the occurrence rate is 1 in a million cases, as I said. But if prions are synthetic, as Professor James Giordano says, he works for DARPA and he is a professor of neurology in Georgetown University, as Professor Xavier from Sao Paulo, Lotzi from the Royal College of London. They all speak about the risks of synthetic prions, which reduce the latent period of those diseases from 20 years. They reduce it to 500 days. And secondly, those synthetic prions have some features which are more dangerous than the features of natural prions. In 2014, to come back to the two Swedish authors, they made some research and wanted to see why in Europeans some genetic mutation occurred at some point in time, which provided the Europeans with a certain benefit in front of the prionic diseases. During the Paleolithic era, 6 million years ago, up to 10,000 years ago, there was a super prion which was subject to zoonosis, so it was transferred from animals to humans, and thus caused pandemic which killed a large part of the European population. The two researchers considered this was killing 75%, between 50 and 75% of the European population was killed then. The problem, as Mr. Schlozman said, that during the preclinical stage, such prions are difficult to detect. And yet they can be transferred further on. People don't know they're infected, yet they transmit the pathogenous agent. In the clinical stage, things are obvious, but how can we identify the infected people? Can everyone check this information? The PCR test is not an actual test. This is why many coronaceptical people say that you don't need to use the PCR to detect the virus. They may be right, but I can assure you, people use PCR to detect prions. The first proof of contamination with prions is the PCR test. Moreover, those who have prionic diseases get cremated or they are put in plastic bags. This doesn't happen for any other disease, but for prionic diseases. What do you believe about it? What do you think about it? Well, you took me to technical issues, technical matters related to a certain biomedical culture and requires specific proficiency. But the big problem is, what do we do with that truth? Shall we convey this truth or not? Is it immoral if we don't convey it? Or is it even more immoral if we don't speak out loud about this truth? And this gets to anarchy. Do people understand when we talk to them, or don't they understand? You know, Jesus tells those who loved and followed him, why don't you understand my speech? Because you don't listen to my word. At some other point in time, Jesus says, if I told you my truth now, you couldn't bear it. So here we have a whole series of positions among the highest moral positions, such as Jesus as a humanitarian model, tell us the following things. There are cases when you'd better not tell the truth. You work on it, you try to promote the truth, you take into account, but you don't utter it, because you harm the idea of promoting truth if you tell the truth. And this is very much related to the way we or the society perceives things. You know this from a long time. Some people see the forest and the others see the trees. Some people don't see the forest because of the trees. There are people who don't see the trees because of the forest. This is a different kind of perception over society, which comes from very ancient types of culture. And I'll give you examples. Asian, Chinese, Japanese cultures, Southeastern Asian cultures see the trees, not the forest, whereas we see the forest all the time. This is why collectivism operates there in their cultures, and they have some ease in controlling the social system. I want to ask you something. For me, the responsibility in our times is central, is core. We can use it by using, in the Romanian cultural space, can we use archaic cultural communication models, or shall we adapt it to our responsibility? We were not talking about them to promote them, but we were only trying to explain them. This is our purpose today. We only want to explain things and help our audience get closer to truth. And we try to explain. There are people There are cultures which see the society or the forest, it's the common good of the society which matters, and this is why we need to observe some rules imposed by our rulers, because it's for the good of our entire society. And there are other cultures where the individual's sake is the one which matters. The individual's freedom to be informed quickly, and this is enshrined in the large book of human rights, to be informed quickly and accurately. But this is a different paradigm. The methodological individualism initiated by Scottish people, also mentioned by Mrs. Merkel when she was elected the head of the Conservative party, and she said to the audience, the Labour Party thought about the class fight, whereas I haven't heard in my life about but about families and individuals. And the entire Blacktown audience burst into a round of applause. They were all individualists and families, but they were not class supporters. So it's a different view on society and individualism. This is precisely the way of thinking which provides the living individualism, whereas the others promote the good of the entire society, whereas individuals need to get subordinated to the society. We all need to be related to and to have the common good over us. Have you ever seen this drawing? This is the Yastro drawing used by Wittgenstein in his writings. What do you see in this picture? A duck. Some people say it is a rabbit. Just turn or bend your head. Some people who see things from right to left see a duck, and from left to right they see a rabbit. People are generally divided between those who see a duck and those who see a rabbit. And here occurs the conflict, from polemics and arguments until wars. Professional or ideological wars were always caused or worsened, where there might have been geopolitical and economic interests at the very beginning, but this was always worsened by the different opinion on world. And here we come again to our ethical question. What's the best for the general interest? Is it better to tell people that this is a prionic disease and there are different protecting mechanisms, or is it better to tell people that this is a worse flu and we need to use vaccines for that to cure it? It is really, really, really a dilemma for me, because you can't decide whom to support, those who see the duck or those who see the rabbit. These are two different paradigms. And this is an ethical dilemma. You're right. And yet Wittgenstein's drawing is very good to illustrate this. And if we were to weigh the arguments for identified in the social field, for instance, we have the mainstream and those who go further from the mainstream, the so-called corona skeptical people. This is a piece of information. I don't say this is truth, but if this breathing flu is a neurodegenerative disease, if we inform them, we would get rid of corona skepticals. I know it's not nice to interrupt you, but there are not too many corona skepticals. there are fewer of them. The problem nowadays is the fight is between those in favor of vaccines and the anti-vaxxers. Anti-vaxxers are individualists who want to choose themselves whether to live or die. But if they are properly informed, well, myself, I need to be properly informed to make a proper choice. For instance, I may have treated very lightly some precaution measures last year as they were recommended. And I received more people in my house than it was necessary. I admit that. But after I had important discussions with specialists, after I received some amazing materials which are all available on the internet, none of those authors are corona skepticals or anti-vaxxers. They are all experts in active immunization technique against prions, and there are surveys which show that the storage mechanism of this spike protein has a prionic structure, and many of the symptoms presented generically as long COVID are very similar to the symptoms of neurodegenerative diseases. The Institute of Neurosciences from Tabriz University in Iran is one of the most well-known neuroscience institutes in the world, and established a link between COVID-19 and Creutzfeldt Jakob. But British people says they walk like a duck, they fly like a duck, they talk like a dog, they are certainly a duck. If there is a virus or a bacteria, basically there are some measures to fight the pandemic which are very strict, but the measures to fight breathing flu, which many people don't think real, those measures which many people consider to be stupid, are rather similar to measures against a prionic disease rather than against flu. If had I known last year what it is all about, could I have been more responsible? If I prevented, if I violated the laws, it was because I was informed by irresponsible decision makers. The decision makers could have informed us better last year for us to take better decisions, to make better decisions. You were responsible to the extent of your knowledge. As they said in the Bible, according to the light you had. You're knowledgeable, you're well informed, and you have a certain wise, critical and creative thinking, side thinking, divergent thinking. I try to make an analysis of types of thinking favorable for the current day. Among them, this is the statistic thinking. Radu, do you really think that all the people on this planet have a statistical thinking? Very few people have it. Very few people are able to imagine what it means 10% of the Romanian population. Many people really try to imagine that. If you noticed over our politics over the last 30 years, very ethical, serious people such as Corneliu Coposu, Romanian politician, at the end of an election round, if they only got 1% of the votes, they are shocked. How come I had so many tours? I met so many people. How come that I only got 1% of the votes? He had he was such a great person, and yet he didn't have a statistic thinking. He couldn't imagine what it meant 1% of the voters. But there wasn't more than 1% of the Romanians in favor of his thinking. You're talking about risks. You're talking about taking some risks, about the difference between a virus-caused disease and a prionic disease. This triggers probability-like thinking. You have such a thinking and you can compute the risks. You may live without an absolute certitude, but you go towards the highest probability. But how many people are able to do that? Probabilistic thinking gets educated in school. We aren't born with it. And those people are able to anticipate, to forecast what will happen within a few years' time according to what they currently know. But they may be wrong as well, because future is not linear. This is why I'm telling you that communicating to people who are not mentally prepared what you want to convey to them may have a devastating social outcome. Look, so I'm not a sociologist, but will you please contradict me? Many of us suffer without or with or without the tutelary authority of the state. How many of us don't want to see the truth? Their life is a mess, and yet they consider to be happy. Most of us happen to do that. Without the state to bother to inoculate a certain opinion on those people, if most people refuse the truth in their private life, they would certainly refuse the truth from the state. But after many people have this way of living, at least the state should leave those people the theoretical probability or possibility to pick between one scenario and the decisions they will make. Nobody allows any decision maker to be a kind of authority over any other individual, irrespective of their training. Not even the common good concept. It depends how you define it. The vectorial result is always the silence. Nobody can define it by themselves. But I think that the talks of last year, and we wasted a year. Last year was anyway a difficult year, and we wasted last year because communication was so poor. A good communication could have saved so many lives. If things are really like that, if this is a neurodegenerative disease instead of a breathing disease, then between the current decision makers and those who communicated Chernobyl is no difference at all. Because we weren't informed that there was a nuclear radioactive accident in Chernobyl. What concerns me is the way this is communicated, whether this is correct. Then we shall consider that the Gorbachev and the Moscow government were right to communicate poorly about Chernobyl. So it is one thing to take measures to avoid a political regime from getting unlegitimate because of a nuclear disaster, and it is a different thing because it was caused by bureaucracy, by the extremely bureaucratic system and decision-making system. Because that bureaucratic system blocked a right decision at the right time. we may not be too far from a bureaucratic issue nowadays. If we'll only be talking for 1 month about this virus and whether it was launched from Wuhan. Wuhan is another aspect of the prionic diseases. This is the first identified virus which mainly has a spike prionic structure, and this structure is due to its location mechanism, to its linkage mechanism to the enzyme of the cell structure, and this can only be derived from a lab. I invited a very known biological weapon guest, which wrote a reference textbook. He sent the PowerPoint of his book, and I said, I don't want to talk about the biological weapons history. I only want to present your works during my show, and I'd like to discuss about COVID, whether COVID is a product of the Wuhan lab. My guest recommended me a film made in UK. He and other researchers bring arguments why this virus could be a result of Wuhan, the Wuhan lab. Well, I watched this movie. I analyzed his speech in front of agents which can cause encephalitis diseases. He was aged 75 years old, and I thought he may have changed his discourse. He may have talked for everybody, for the large audience. And I asked him whether Wuhan may be a narrative enshrined in a different narrative, that is a diversion, because the virus could have derived from Wuhan. Well, it's not fair to provide the email, but the researcher kept telling me, stay with the film. What does it mean? I am the TV moderator, and I have some doubts. I take into account what colleagues of his publicized articles in Georgetown University and the Royal College of London. They wrote articles about prions and how they are used in research for Alzheimer's disease. And this is also a warning that prions could also be used as a biological weapon. And I asked my guest, couldn't the narrative of those investing billions in the research of synthetic prions are directly liable for this virus? And is that Wuhan is a narrative? And he says, I need to withdraw my acceptance to listeners in your debate. So he refused to participate in my show anymore. But I didn't ask impossible things. But I guess I touched a very sensitive issue. And this Mr. Milton Leitenberg, this researcher, was disturbed by this. Yes, but is it possible that this may be bad for some other entity that he doesn't want to disturb? Habermas has got a very interesting book about the ethics of the public discourse, and among other things, he said it is only ethical not to say things you don't believe yourself. Radu, this is not intuitive belief. Oh, I'm tempted or I lean to believe this. I believe this because I have facts and arguments. And if you don't have facts and arguments for that, you simply shut up, or you say, I'm tempted to say this, but my belief is not doesn't rely on research. Some people say that the virus was caused by Wuhan, so my arguments could only help them believe. And I was so astonished how softly he argumented, and he argued that the virus could have been issued from Wuhan, and yet he had many other arguments which he didn't convey, and he had public arguments. So you simply helped him, and he refused to attend your show. And one more thing, this show is an outstanding opportunity to talk to people from the entire planet. Yes, your show called Worlds in Collision. Yes. I had some corona skepticals or anti-vaxxers invited in my show, and I contacted the leaders of the anti-vaxxers from Germany and from Switzerland. I felt it great to feel what they believed by phone. And they all recited a poem, and they weren't genuine in their arguments, which made me believe, isn't that true that this trend is a lab party intended to make people disbelieve such a matter? And it's a matter of image vectors, very notorious ones. Many of them are lawyers, judges, biology professors, and they are speaking as if they were in a communist meeting. Their arguments are not solid. If I bring additional public arguments to them, if I provide them with the opportunity to talk and to express themselves, because they don't have the stage to present their ideas, none of them wants to speak. When you provide them with the opportunity to talk, when you bring arguments to them, none of them is willing to talk. Silence. Well, 2 years ago, I wrote a book with my wife, Corina Matei. It was a survey called The Non-Painful Ethics of Funded Research. This is a comment with comments about transgressions of ethical principles of various researchers from the medical system and more broadly from the biomedical system. Radu, it's quite a disaster. It's a mess. Because there is data provided by Gucci in a book published in Torino. I bought it from there. From Torino, I brought it in Romania. Enrico Bucci, Cattivi e scienziati, la frode nella ricerca scientifica, fraud in the scientific research, Turin 2018. It's a disaster with respect to the researchers' capacity to falsify or to forge the outcomes, either for getting promoted or to attract funding or to preserve financing for their departments or for their universities, or else out of moral obligation towards their bosses. So it is quite an entire list of reasons. Enrico Bucci made some research at a world level with respect to biomedical research, and he concluded that 70% of researchers admit to have made compromises with the scientific truth, or they're willing to make a compromise with the scientific truth. Can you imagine that? This is a maximal This is turning things marketable. Things get sold on the market. So knowledge gets marketable. If you're ready and willing to sell knowledge for money, if you sell knowledge bought by more people or by people with more money, such as the pharma industry, it's depressing. It's impossible to imagine. You simply don't know what to believe anymore, except for God. If you can't trust science, then what else can you trust? If you can't trust scientific authorities anymore, if they aren't moral authorities, then who can you trust? Yes, there is an authority, and this exists in politics. There is ethics in science and politics. So, under the current circumstances, is this a scenario where ethics can justify such behavior? I know this is not dominant. This is why, Radu, we really need to have discussions about ethics, precisely because it doesn't exist. So we contribute to more moral, to more ethics, because we invoke it all the time. This is a matter of discourse hygiene. Yes, of course. I don't want our audience to consider us nuts or mad. We believe between Zai and Zoller, what it exists and what should exist. If we only get adapted to Zai's or the reality, we're nicely dressed animals wearing a tie. But if we have a project telling us that we need to live by those means, then we can get two wings and we can fly. This is why I tell you that if ethics doesn't exist, we need to talk about it. There's an old Chinese proverb that goes like that: work is the ideal of lazy people. Great, because people who work dream about rest, not about work, because they work all the time. It's like in Chekhov. They worked, the boyard dreamt about working with the peasants, but they were drunk all the time. This happens in various areas of life. Unfortunately, Mr. Bortun, we're at the end of this show, and since we talked about ethics at the last part of this show, I'll invite you for another debate about ethics. A few weeks ago, we had Professor Beatrice Ioan, forensics and bioethics professor from Iași, and I'll invite her with you for discussion, because he mentioned to what extent it's important to talk about ethics to make sure ethics is conveyed throughout science. I heard the same idea from yourself, and this is why I consider you're both of the same opinion. Thank you so much for attending this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a nice Sunday. I hope I didn't upset you with this topic, and I'll invite you next Sunday, a new show, Worlds in Collision, and I know you'll be here faithful to us for this show. Thank you so much for your attendance.